Welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, my friends over at Para-Bellum-Games have sent me a Mahut. There we go, a Mahut. So we're going to be painting this in today's video, and also they sent me a favorite of Hormus, Maharaja. So we're going to be painting that variant of the Mahut. So for the Sorcerer Kings, this was a much anticipated release. It kind of helps buff up the ranged shooting options of the faction, as well as give us a second monster box to choose from. So without further ado, we're going to get started with the painting. But I do want to remind everybody, if you want to save 10% on your first purchase from the Para-Bellum-Games web store, you can use our discount code, JTS Wargaming. There should be a graphic on the screen somewhere, and there will be links down in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and go down to the hobby desk, and we'll talk a little bit about how I prepared all of the miniatures. Alright, so here is the fully assembled Mahut, and the miniature is large enough to where you can go ahead, fully assemble it, and you still have plenty of room to get a paintbrush into all of the nooks and crannies. You could, if you wanted, this upper platform that forms the howdah, could leave that separate, and the inside of the model is hollow, so that gives you a way where you can kind of get your hand inside and hold it from different angles if you really were worried about, how you would paint something this large. But I don't think we're going to run into any problems with it being fully assembled. Now, the box art for the Mahut has it painted the body completely white. So in the lore, Hormus, who was the Maharaja who creates the Mahuts and then gives them out to people, he had a pet elephant that was so near and dear to his heart, and when it passed away, he would create these elemental constructs, and then they never quite lived up to the memory of his favored pet in his head, so then he gets dissatisfied with it and gives it away. So it's conceivable that the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Mahuts that he's created, he would have experimented with different types of rock. So we're not going to do the white scheme, which almost kind of reminds me of like a porcelain or something. I'm going to actually be going for a granite scheme, which is really cool. It's going to add a lot of texture and variation to the color on the miniature, but then you can also take this process and slightly alter it if you wanted to experiment with some other colors. So the base of that, we went ahead and primed the entire Mahut black, and now for our Maharaja rider, I went with a zenithal prime. So for anyone who's not familiar, that's spraying black all over and then spraying gray in a 45-degree halo around, and then pure white primer from the top where the most light would be hitting the model. And as you can see, we've got really nice variations in our grayscale here. And on the Maharaja, we're going to be using a lot of speed paint style paints to allow this undercoat to really show through. Now, because of the shape of the model and because it's not standing on a base, I highly do recommend using a paint handle for this. And so I just put a little square flex magnet on the bottom of it so it'll stick to the top of my paint handle. And then at the end, once we've painted the Maharaja and the Mahut, and we have to do that final assembly, this will peel off very easily, and then we can super glue it onto the Mahut. So with all of that prep out of the way, oh, I do want to mention, the Mahut kit actually comes with four Danur disciples, because the standard version of it has four archers that provide it shooting attack. So now for those, I highly recommend that you fully assemble them, and then you can just use a dot of super glue to glue them down to a wooden stick like I did here, and then paint them separate before you put them in the howdah. Now, one thing I do want to mention, we're not going to actually paint these archers today. I have another video where I've already shown a painting guide of how to get the Danur archers painted. So I'm going to put a link to that up in the cards somewhere around here. 3 years. I'm still learning where to point. But yeah, so we're not going to paint these guys today. Check out that video to learn how to paint those. But again, Zenithal Prime on these, and I primarily used speed paints to paint the archers, and I'm going to do the same thing with these guys. All right, so the very first thing we're going to start out with is the Maharaja, which is going to be the simpler part of the paint job. We're really just going to be laying down a few contrast speed paint style paints. So the very first bit that we're going to work on is going to be her skin. Now, in the lore, the Sorcerer Kings are a darker skinned people, and my favorite color for doing that skin tone has been this pure grime from the AK Deep Shades range. Now, this is a thicker contrast style paint, and I find that it's slightly less pigmented. So I normally do need a couple of coats in order to get good coverage. So we're going to lay down one coat of coverage and then kind of see where we're at. So all you want to do is apply a generous amount to the area that you're targeting with your brush, and then just kind of move it around so that it doesn't pull. And there's not a ton of her skin showing. It's mostly her face and then the upper part of her chest, her hands, and then her feet. Alright, so here we are after 2 coats of the pure grime on the skin, and that second coat is still drying, but you can see we've already got some really nice tone, and we've still retained that undercoat, even though we used 2 coats of the paint. So now we're going to move on to a relatively small detail, her hair, and we're going to hit that with Black Templar contrast paint. Now, there's not a lot of this to do because the headdress that she's wearing actually covers up a good bit of her hair. And if you get any of this on that headdress, that's okay. We're actually going to be painting that metallic later. But if you manage to get this on the pillows, you will want to touch that back up with either a light gray or a white. Alright, so now you've got a choice. So with the Maharaja, like all of the Sorcerer King's wizards, you have the Court of Fire or the Court of Air at the time of filming. We may get some other courts in the future. So I wanted the color of her dress to represent which court she belonged to. So since I'm going for a Court of Fire, I'm going to use Poppy Red from the Army Painter 2.0 Speed Paint range. If you were going to go Court of Air, blue or a green would really, really work. If you were going to go blue, I would suggest Magic Blue from Army Painter. But all we're going to do, and I have some of this already out on my wet palette so I can control it on my brush, and all of the robes we're going to give a coat of this color. Now, because they're kind of long and flowing and you have some curves but lots of smooth surfaces, I recommend that you work it one section at a time to make sure that you can get nice smooth coverage. And if you hit any of the like beads and pearls that she has all over the dress, that's okay. We'll be covering those up with standard acrylics later on, but try to avoid hitting the pillows if you can. So with the dress complete, we can now move on to base coating the pillows. So what I recommend for these is there's 6 pillows on the miniature. So I recommend getting a good assortment of different contrast slash speed paints for this, and kind of spread them around. So you could go one color for each pillow. Here I'm just going to use 4, and a couple of the colors will get repeated. What I do recommend though is whatever color you painted her dress, do not use a color that either matches that color or has that color in it. So for instance, because I used red on her dress, I'm not going to paint any of the pillows red. I'm also going to avoid colors like orange or pink. So you want the dress to stand out from the pillows, so that you don't lose any definition in the miniature. So what I opted for is Sand Golem Speed Paint, a Charming Chartreuse, which I absolutely love this color, Magic Blue, and I'm going to use Purple Tone ink from the War Paints range. This kind of almost works like a contrast slash speed paint, especially if you add a little bit of speed paint medium to it. I'd probably go about 3 drops of this and 1 drop of the medium. So I'm going to go ahead and get these on my wet palette so that we can control them. Alright, so all you're going to do here is go through each of the colors. And just like we did with the dress, because these are kind of flat areas, you do want to kind of work them in sections so that you're not getting brush strokes and streaking in the finish. But we're just going to go ahead and put a layer of this on each of the pillows in turn. Alright, so with the pillows colored in, the miniature is actually really starting to come together. So here you can see I duplicated the blue, so there's 2 blue pillows, and then there's 2 of the chartreuse pillows, and then I also carried a little bit of the purple into the wraps on the sand yellow pillow as well. So next up, we're going to work on this stone dais that she's sitting on. And for that, we're just going to hit it with a raw coat of Griff Charger Gray contrast paint. So nothing fancy with this. We just want to hit all of that stonework. You do want to be very careful as you get close to the things that we've already painted. So if you get a little bit of this on something very quickly, wash your brush out and then soak it back up before it starts to dry. And you'll be able to clean up your mistakes pretty quickly like that. Alright, so with that step done, we are now out of slap chop territory, and we're going to move on to some basic layering to finish up the rest of our favored of Hormus. So, being that she's a favored Maharaja, she has an absolutely stupid amount of gold trinkets scattered everywhere. So I'm going to break out Elven Gold from Scale 75's Metal and Alchemy range. Alright, so as I was saying a second ago, there is so much gold on this model, it's kind of crazy. So we're going to be hitting the headdress completely in this color. But then you're also going to want to make sure you do all of the trim on the pillows, as well as all of the jewelry that she's wearing, like on her wrists and scattered throughout her garments. And some of these areas are going to be in slightly harder to reach places, so I highly recommend that you switch to a liner brush. I'm personally going to use a size 2 liner, and that'll give you a really nice fine tip so that you can hit those hard to reach areas. Alright, so with that base layer of Elven Gold applied, now we're going to highlight all of those areas with Scale 75 Citrine Alchemy. And I would say that if you wanted to do the trim on the pillows, that's probably completely optional. It is a very time-consuming and somewhat frustrating part of the miniature to paint, and will most likely require some cleanup work. So if you wanted to skip it, I would completely understand. But definitely make sure that you highlight all of the gold that's actually on the Maharaja herself. Right, so to help clean up the blue pillows, I'm going to use Scale 75 Canterbury Blue. And as you can see, if we compare it to the Magic Blue, it makes a very nice sort of shadow color, which will look decent when bumped up against the gold. Now, I purposely chose blue for my pillows that had trim for this reason. So if you chose to do a different color, you'll want to choose a cleanup paint that matches your speed paint as closely as possible. So we're just going to go in and help sharpen all of those gold areas by filling back in our blue. Then for any areas that we need to clean up that are sort of in a highlight area, I'm going to use Sky Blue from Scale of 75 for those areas. So you can kind of see right here where we use the Canterbury, and it was sort of in a highlight region. We could take our Sky Blue over top of that, and that'll help blend it in better with those high points. With that cleanup done, we can go ahead and wash all of the gold jewelry that's on the Maharaja herself. We're not going to wash the trim on the pillows just quite yet. So for that, we're going to use Seraphim Sepia, and I've cut that 50-50 with a little bit of speed paint medium, just to help it flow nicely and to dilute it. And we're just going to put a coat of this all over all of her gold jewelry and headdress. And for our next detail, all of these little tassels that are connected to some of the pillows and the dress, we're going to hit with Scale 75 Irako. Right, so nothing fancy here. You just want to be very careful and not get this color on anything that we've already painted. But this will give you a nice sort of muted yellow, yellowish brown tone. It looks really good for these little cloth bits. Alright, so there's one last detail to base coat, and that's all of the beads and pearls that she has draped all over her dress and on this one pillow. And now I'm going to paint those as jade. So we're going to base coat all of those with AK Acrylic Emerald. And then we're going to highlight the prominent ones that are going to be getting more light in mint green, also from AK. Right, so for this base coat, we want to be as precise as possible. So I'm using my liner brush, and without a lot on the brush itself, we're going to rotate the mini so that we can get the best possible position and very carefully run lines along these beads. Right, so with all of those pearls now base coated, we can come in with the mint green and just hit the areas that are upturned and gonna get more light. So don't feel that you need to, retouch every single strand that we just did. Just some areas like the top of that one pillow and these down here at the bottom. Maybe this strand right here. Right, and for the last little bit of shading that we need to do, I'm going to break out my Nuln Oil Special Juice. So this is the new formulation of Nuln Oil that comes in the same size pot as the contrast paints. Thinned out 50% with some speed paint medium. And then I also add a couple of drops of flow improver. And this will help it almost kind of behave like an oil wash. It wants to really, really run into the textures of the miniature. So we're going to use this mix and just shade all of those beads. And this will really help you get that individual definition along the strands. And then we're also going to run some of this along the gold trim on the pillows. And that's going to really help that detail to pop. Alright, so while we're waiting on that thinned out Nuln Oil to dry, I've decided I wanted to do sort of a spell effect on her outstretched hand. So we're going to turn back to Canterbury Blue. Now, I already have this on my palette, so I'm just going to thin it out with a good bit of water to make sort of a slightly strong glaze consistency. And we're just going to run this all over the hand. Then we're going to quickly wash off our brush. Just kind of get the excess off. And then kind of move that around so that it's nice and thin. Then what I'm going to do is take our sky blue, and this isn't quite thinned as much, and while that's wet with my liner brush, I'm going to line the inside of all of her fingers, then also get the prominent pads of her hand to give some of that definition back. And now I'm going to mix in a little bit of white, just a little bit on my brush, into the sky blue to lighten it up. And we're going to use this mix and get closer to her fingertips. And then with pure white, and you don't want a lot on your brush, we're just going to put a dot of this on each fingertip. And once that's dry, we're going to thin out a little bit of Frostheart, about 50-50 with some speed paint medium. And then we're just going to do a glaze over top of that spell effect. And so we don't want a lot on our brush. So on my thumbnail, you can see how faint that is. And then we're just going to apply this all over her palm and fingertips. And that'll just help smooth out the transition between the three types of blues. And then you'll notice I put this same mix inside of her eye socket. And we can just come in with this thinned out Frostheart and make that a little bit more intense. Whoop. All right, so our Maharaja, our favorite of Hormus, is almost done. So the very last thing I'm going to do, so on the red robes, I'm not entirely happy with how the poppy red that we used from Army Painter, it's sort of, we've got different shades. We've got pinks, we've got reds, we've kind of got magenta. So we're going to even that out a little bit. with a very thin layer of Carmine Dawn from the AK Deep Shade range. So because these deep shades are very, very thin as far as their pigment load goes, you can use these as sort of a filter so that you can strengthen the color of what's underneath. So we're going to work straight from the pot with this, but we don't want our brush super overloaded. And we're just going to put a nice even layer of this all over that red cloth. And this will sort of tint it with a little bit more of that magenta and even out the colors just a little bit. You're still going to retain, you know, all of the shading from our zenithal and such, because this is already so translucent. This will tint those pink areas and bring those back toward red, and it'll boost our shadows. So here we are after one pass, and you can see we've already got some pretty nice benefit out of doing this. I'm going to go ahead and do one more pass, and I'll show you what the improved robes look like. Alright, so here we are after just 2 passes, and you can do as much or as little of this as you want, this color correction. However, the more layers that you add, the more you lose the difference between your shadows, your midpoints, and your highlights. Even though the paint's transparent, the more layers you add, it starts to become opaque. So I'm actually fairly happy with where we are right here. So I'm going to call the Maharaja done, and now we can start working on the Mahut itself. Alright, so now it's time to work on the Mahut itself. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'm going to be doing my Mahut as if it were made of granite instead of that, you know, pure white finish that the official color scheme has. After all, there are hundreds of these that were made, you know, in existence in the lore, and chances are Hormus probably, you know, made them all slightly differently. So by doing a granite sort of scheme, that gives us a tremendous amount of flexibility in our color choice for how we paint this. So on the screen, I'm going to put up some pictures of some different samples of granite. And with that being a composite rock, which means it's made up of multiple different types of minerals, you can see that there's lots of different color expression in granite. So you've got browns, you've got blacks, you've got blues, you've got grays. You can even have crazy colors like orange and green kind of all sprinkled throughout your rock. So what I'm going to do is use brown gray from scale 75, graphite from scale 75, and Arctic blue, and I'm going to get these all down on a paper plate, and then we're just going to stipple these all over the main body of the Mahut to give it that sort of broken up rocky texture. So I've got my 3 colors spaced out on my palette, and I'm using a makeup brush for this. And literally all we're going to do is stipple these colors all over the main body of the Mahut. Now, I am going to leave the very top of the howdah separate. We're not going to paint that just yet. We'll get to that later. And as you're going through, you don't have to do all one color once. You can dab into a different color and apply that and just kind of move around. The idea here, though, is that you want this to be fairly random, and you do still want some of that black showing through by having some of that prime layer show through. That just means we don't have to do this with black. We can just use these three colors, and that'll be enough. Do make sure that you get into the shadow areas that people will be able to see. And I'm going to continue on, and then I'll come back when this step is complete. Alright, so with all of that stippling done, this is what we're looking like right now. And I know it looks crazy, but trust the process. I promise it's going to get better. So, what we're going to do is now sort of diffuse and help blend all of these three different colors, well, technically four with the black, together a little bit. And so for that, we're going to turn to an enamel product. This is a dark gray for white filter by Ammo by Mig. And now these filters are very, very super transparent paints. You want to make sure that you give them a good shake. And then we're going to just lay down a thin layer and take a look at what it does to our base coat. Alright, now this Mahut is actually so large, it's a little hard to paint this on camera. But all we're going to do is just lightly drag our loaded brush over the miniature so that we get a nice layer of this all over our acrylic base coat. And this is just going to slightly add that tint of brown on top. And now, since this is enamel, if you want to speed up the drying time, once you're done, you can hit it with a, what do you call those things? Hair dryer. And that'll help speed it up. But otherwise, you can let it sit for about 30 minutes or so, and then come back and take a look. Alright, so now that filter layer hasn't even completely dried yet. And you can already see it's already starting to do that diffusing that we needed for it to do. So I'm going to keep letting this dry, and then we'll move on when we're ready for the next step. Alright, so now we're going to add in another filter layer, and we're going to focus mostly on the areas that are going to be getting the most light. And so what I've done, I've taken this AK blue-gray wash, and I've added about 50-50, ratio of mineral spirits to help thin it down. So on my thumbnail, you can kind of see how thin that is. And now all we're going to do is similar to what we did in the previous step. Any areas that are raised, we're just going to run some of this light blue over those areas. And you can just pick this right up out of the recesses if it happens to start to run on you, which makes cleanup a breeze. Alright, so here we are after about 3 coats of the blue-gray wash, and I'm going to go ahead and let this fully dry, and then we will move on to the rest of our base coats. Alright, so as you can see, we've made some drastic improvements over the last section of the video. So I went ahead and did a lot of the other base coats off camera. There wasn't really anything special about the way they were painted. A lot of it was speed paint or very basic base coating and simple highlighting. So I'm just going to run through the color choices that I had in case people want to, mimic those paints. And then we'll move on to the more interesting bit. So for this purple here, I just based that area in white and then hit it with Magos Purple contrast paint. The tusk here, I went ahead and just left those white. I'm still contemplating if maybe I'm going to hit them with Vallejo Ivory, but I wanted the tusk to be white. The copper dangly bits on the head and the face were based with true copper, then washed with purple tone, and then dry brushed with evil chrome. The metal was Citadel Ironbreaker with a little bit of Nuln oil to wash it. And then for all of the gold inlays in the body, we hit those with scale 75 Dwarven Gold, and then did a little bit of highlighting with Elven Gold, also from scale 75. And then for these slightly green tinted gold bits up top, that was Aztec Gold from Army Painter. And then lastly, for the Howdah on the back, I based that whole thing in gray. Any gray will work. And then we hit it with a relatively thick coat of Griff Charger Gray contrast paint. And then we hit it with a very light dry brush of a neutral gray to pick out the edges. So now what we're going to do is try to sell the effect that this is a magical, golem construct walking around the battlefield. So these gold inlays have some really deep grooves, and I've set and coated the miniature right now. And so we're going to use this Wargame enamel liquid pigment, the blue fluorescent, and we're going to run this down into those deep recesses and make it look like there's a little bit of magical glow spilling out in those areas. All right, so the satin coat that I applied is going to help protect the underlying paint from me having to touch the model, but it's also going to help this pigment flow better, since satin is a smoother finish than matte. Once we drop this down into the recesses, it will start to flow inside those crevices. And also because it's smoother, when we go to clean this up, because it's going to get on the raised areas a little bit, you kind of can't avoid that. It'll make it easier to wipe it off. And here we are with the fluorescent pigment applied, and it's a little subtle in some areas, but if you look at the crevice dead on, you get that nice bright blue color. And then you can see on the surface of the model, I didn't quite remove all of the excess, I just kind of diffused it. And that helps to sell, the fact that there's a little bit of a glow coming out of these spaces. So because this was enamel, before we can move on with our acrylics, I'm going to go ahead, give this a little bit of time to cure overnight, and then we'll work on some final details. All right, so here is where the project actually deviated just a little bit. So one of the things I love about Para-Bellum-Games is that they're really active with their community on their Discord server. So I had posted a work in progress photo of the Mahut after I'd applied the blue shading, the neon blue, enamel pigment that we just did in the last step. And I wasn't necessarily, looking for any feedback. I was just, sharing with the community. And Leandros on the Para-Bellum team actually, left me some comments. And he had suggested, since we were using purple as an accent color for the earrings, as well as the little face, shawl on the Mahut, that I should consider adding purple shading to other elements of the model as well. So I went ahead and did that, and I was pretty happy with how it turned out. So let's go back down to the hobby desk, and I'll show you what it looks like. So as you can see we've added some of that purple shading on all of the gold areas of the miniature. And so we ended up losing some of that, bright neon blue. But the overall general effect I'm pretty happy with. So it darkened it down in some areas to more of a violet, like here. But then in other areas, you still get that bright blue kind of glow showing through. Now, once that was done, oh, and by the way, I used Magos Purple, just like I did for these elements here. Now, to re-highlight those areas back up, so for the standard gold that's on the majority of the body, I used Elven Gold again, but I mixed in a little bit of Citrine Alchemy just to really, really help it pop and contrast with that purple shading. And then up here, these Aztec Gold areas, I just highlighted with Aztec Gold. And then you'll also notice that some of the gems are now green, and I painted those the same exact way that we did the jade beads on the Maharaja herself. But now all that's left to do are just the last few gem effects on the miniature, and then we can move on to the final assembly and the basing. So I've given the model an all-over matte enamel coat. So that's going to be really, really tough, really hard wearing. Enamel varnishes are really, really strong, and I wanted to make sure that this paint job was protected. And so now we're going to paint those gems because they're going to have a glossy effect, and it'll help them stand out from the rest of the miniature. All right, so for the gems that are remaining, some of them are going to be red, and some of them are going to be green. So these technical Spirit Stone and Waystone colors, they're really thick, translucent gloss paints that work best over a metallic base coat, and it's very easy to use these and get a really nice gem effect without doing it the traditional layering method. So to start out, I'm going to use Ironbreaker, and I'm doing this on these sort of multifaceted gems on the side. And we're just going to go ahead and get a nice quick all over base coat. And there's another one of these on the other side in the same position. So just make sure you coat both of those. Alright, so now with that Ironbreaker applied, we're now going to use Vallejo Chrome to highlight the sharp edges of those gems. So they have some very, very sharp lines, so I've switched over to my liner brush so that I have maximum control. And you don't want a lot of paint on your brush. You want a very nice sharp tip. And just go ahead and draw those lines up the sides. And then for all of the other gems, we're just going to completely coat those in this chrome as well. Alright, so with all of that metallic applied, now we can move on to our gemstone paints. And now you want to use these straight from the pot. So I've got the Spirit Stone red here. And they are going to be thick, and that's okay. So you just want to make sure that you have enough on your brush, but not so much that, it's overloaded and you can't control it. And then you can just apply a layer of this right over top of your gem. And if you need more pigmentation in an area, if you ran out of paint on your brush, you can just gently tap a little bit of extra in those areas. Alright, so I'm going to finish up the rest of my gemstones and do the final assembly, and then I'll take you guys down to a shot of this all finished on a spinning table and show you what it looks like. Alright, so here is the finished Mahut with all of the components assembled. We've got the favored of Hormus up in the Howdah. I do want to take a moment and really thank Para-Bellum-Games for sending me out the two kits so that I could get them painted and show them off for everyone. I had a ton of fun with this project, and even though it took some unexpected turns, I'm actually really, really happy with how it turned out. Again, huge shout out to Leandros on the development team for sharing some tips out in the community Discord. And let me know down in the comments what everybody thought about how the Mahut turned out and how it compares to the original studio scheme. That super bright white just did not look right for me. Alright, so that's pretty much it for this video, guys. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will catch you all in the next video.